Sometimes people don't run because they're weak. They run because staying means feeling too much. In this story, a daughter who never forgave, a man who never stayed, and a child who sees everything will find themselves bound by a place that refuses to let them hide. What begins as an obligation becomes something far deeper, something neither of them expected, and both of them needed. Stay with this story, because it may remind you of something you've been avoiding too.
The paper was soft, the edges furred like a moth's wing from a decade of folding and unfolding. It was the 8th time Eleanor Voss had transcribed this specific set of coordinates onto a fresh sheet of stationery. She had written it first in a drafty boarding house in Philadelphia when she was 18, then again in the quiet corners of the girls' school library where she kept the ledgers, and finally, 7 days ago, under the flickering gaslight of a lawyer's office. This 8th scrap of paper felt heavier than the others. Eleanor sat perfectly upright in the wooden seat of the southbound car, her spine a rigid line against the jolting rhythm of the Central Pacific. Outside the window, the Sacramento Valley was a riot of green and gold, the earth steaming after 3 weeks of relentless rain. "The skies finally opened up," the woman in the seat beside her remarked, fanning herself with a handkerchief. "The ground is breathing again. Can you smell it, dear? It's the scent of things starting over." Eleanor turned her gaze toward the window. To the woman, the damp earth smelled of renewal. To Eleanor, it smelled like the mud that would eventually claim every secret a man tried to bury. "I hadn't noticed," Eleanor said quietly. She clutched her leather handbag tighter. Inside lay 3 months of letters she had yet to open, the final words of Harlan Voss. She told herself she was here for the 340 acres, a legal formality to be settled so she could return to the safety of her ledgers in Philadelphia. She told herself she didn't want to understand the man who had abandoned her. But as the train whistled, a lonely, piercing sound that echoed off the distant Sierra Nevadas, she knew she was lying. She wasn't running toward a legacy. She was running toward a closure she was terrified to find. 5 miles south, Calhoun Reed stood at the edge of the creek, his boots sinking into the silt. The water was high, rushing over the gray stones with a frantic, chattering energy, but the levels were safe. He stayed there anyway. Watching the water was the only morning ritual that didn't taste like the Pinkerton Agency. For 12 years, Calhoun had lived by a clock set by other men's crimes and other men's fears. Here, on this patch of Sacramento dirt, the only authority was the sun and the season. He was a man who had forgotten how to exist in a space he didn't have to defend, and these 7 weeks of minding the place had been a strange, quiet purgatory. Thump, thump, thump. The sound came from the direction of the stables. It was steady, rhythmic, the sound of a 9-year-old boy named Pete beating his palms against the cedar siding to call the horses for grain. Calhoun didn't turn around. He knew the boy was there, just as he knew the exact weight of the Colt, 44 on his hip in the direction of the wind shifting from the west. He had lived in this house for nearly 2 months, but every time he heard that rhythmic thumping, it reminded him that he was an intruder. He was a man holding a ghost's keys, waiting for a clock to run out. According to the lawyer's letter, he had 7 days left of his 8-week watch. Just 1 more week, Calhoun thought, his eyes tracking a hawk circling above. Then I'm back to the trail, back to being moving glass. He didn't realize that his hands were clenched. He didn't realize that for the first time in a decade he wasn't looking for an exit. He was looking for a reason to stay that didn't feel like a betrayal of his own restless soul. The buckboard dropped Eleanor off at the gate just as the sun began its long golden slant toward the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of wild poppies and damp oak. She stood there for a moment, her brown traveling dress dusted with the grit of the road, looking at the house. It wasn't the mansion of a successful lawyer. It was a sturdy, low-slung ranch house built of timber and stone, looking as though it had grown directly out of the hillside. Then she saw him. A man emerged from the shadow of the porch. He was tall, his frame honed by years of hard travel, wearing a hat pulled low and a duster that had seen better days. He didn't move with the frantic energy of a farmhand. He moved with the predatory stillness of a man who saw everything before it saw him. Eleanor stepped forward, her heels clicking on the packed earth. Calhoun stopped 10 paces away. He didn't tip his hat. He didn't offer a smile. He simply watched her with eyes the exact shade of the creek stones after a storm, a gray so deep it was almost silver. "You're the daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. He saw the shape of Harlan Voss's jaw in her face, the same stubborn set of the shoulders. "And you are the man holding my father's land," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm the man who promised to watch it," Calhoun corrected softly. "There's a difference." They stood in the silence of the valley, two people who had built their lives on the art of leaving, suddenly forced to stand still. Eleanor saw a man who looked like he was waiting for a fight or a flight. Calhoun saw a woman who looked like she had decided the world was a ledger that needed balancing, and she was the only one holding the pen. Good, Eleanor thought. He wants to leave as much as I do. We can finish this quickly. Good, Calhoun thought. She's here to sign the papers. I can be on the road by morning. The narrator, invisible and knowing, could have told them both. They were both running from the same thing, the terrifying realization that they had no one left to run to. One was running forward into the void, the other was running backward into a closed door. By 8 o'clock that evening, the kitchen table of the main house was illuminated by a single guttering oil lamp. A young lawyer named Harrington had arrived from town, his leather satchel bulging with the intricacies of Harlan Voss's final will. He laid the papers out with the practiced solemnity of a man who enjoyed the weight of his own importance. "It's a bit unusual," Harrington admitted, glancing between Eleanor and Calhoun. Pete sat at the far end of the table, methodically eating a bowl of corn mush. To the boy, this was just another evening, but to the adults, the air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. "What is unusual?" Eleanor asked, her pen ready. "The 8-week clause," Harrington said. "Mr. Voss was quite specific. The land cannot be settled, sold, transferred, or claimed until the legal heir and the designated manager have spent a concurrent period of 15 days on the property together to oversee a final inventory. No proxies, no exceptions. 15 days? Here Calhoun's voice was a low growl. "I've been here 7 weeks. The papers said 8. "The clock for the concurrent period starts when the heir arrives," Harrington explained. "Mr. Voss wanted the two of you to witness the truth of the place together. He even added a provision that if either of you leaves before the 15 days are up, the land is forfeited to a public auction to pay off his outstanding debts in Philadelphia." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "He's forcing us to stay?" "He's asking you to see," Harrington countered gently. Eleanor looked across the table. Calhoun was staring at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the only sound was the clink of Pete's spoon against his bowl. 15 days, Calhoun said, the words tasting like ash. 15 days, Eleanor echoed, her grip tightening on her shawl. Pete looked up from his mush, his blue eyes darting from the woman to the man. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and spoke to no one in particular. "The lamp in the back bedroom is burnt out," the boy said. "I can show the lady where the spares are if she wants." Eleanor looked at the child, then back at the man who held her father's secrets in the calluses of his hands. The valley outside was silent, the damp earth waiting. The 15-day countdown had begun. The dawn in the Sacramento Valley did not break so much as it bled, a slow, bruised purple that seeped over the jagged teeth of the Sierras until the mist in the hollows turned to silver. Pete Greer was awake long before the light. At 9 years old, he had the internal clock of a seasoned ranch hand, a survival mechanism born from a father who believed sleep was a luxury the poor couldn't afford, and a mother who had vanished into the eastern horizon before Pete could even remember the scent of her hair. Pete's world was measured in 3 things: the height of the creek, the mood of the horses, and the silence of the big house. He sat on the porch steps, his small, calloused hands resting on his knees. He was wearing a shirt 2 sizes too big, the sleeves rolled up into thick donuts at his elbows. Around his neck, hidden beneath the collar, was a leather cord holding a single brass button, blackened by time but heavy with a significance only he and a dead man understood. He watched the two strangers. In the kitchen, he could hear the rhythmic clack-clink of the lady, Miss Eleanor. She moved with a desperate sort of precision, as if by arranging the tin plates in perfect rows, she could prevent her life from tilting. In the yard, he saw Mr. Calhoun. The man didn't move like a farmer. He moved like a hawk, circling the perimeter, checking the latch on every gate, his eyes always flicking toward the road. Pete knew things about them that they didn't know about themselves. He knew the lady looked at objects before she looked at people. He knew the man looked at the horizon before he looked at the room. And he knew that neither of them really wanted to be here, which made them exactly like his father had been. Eleanor found the boy sitting by the stable door an hour later. She held a leather-bound ledger and a fountain pen, her face set in the mask of a school teacher about to grade a difficult exam. "The inventory list mentions a laborer's quarters," Eleanor said, her voice crisp. "Is that where you stay, Peter?" The boy didn't look up from the piece of leather he was greasing. "I stay where Mr. Voss told me to stay, in the small room off the kitchen. My father died in the quarters. Mr. Voss said the air there was too heavy with the fever for a growing boy." Eleanor flinched. The mention of her father, of his kindness to a stranger's child while she had lived in a silent apartment 3,000 miles away, stung like lie. "I see," she said, stepping into the shade of the barn. "I need to catalog the tack and the livestock. Mr. Harrington says there is a mare?" "She's in the end stall," Pete said, finally looking up. His eyes were startlingly old for his face. "She's heavy with a foal. Due in a month, maybe less. She needs the bran mash twice a day and her legs rubbed down. My father said if I don't stay, she might lose the foal. She's a nervous one." Eleanor looked at the boy. He wasn't asking for a home. He was presenting a technical requirement. He was offering her a reason to let him stay that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with the truth of the place. "I am a bookkeeper, Peter. I know nothing of horses," Eleanor admitted. "I know enough for both of us," Pete replied, "as long as I'm here to do it." Eleanor opened her ledger. "My father? Did he speak of me?" The question escaped before she could catch it. She hated herself for it. She had spent a decade pretending she didn't exist in his world, yet here she was begging for scraps of memory from a 9-year-old. Pete paused, the grease tin open in his lap. He read letters. Every night. He'd sit by the lamp and fold them up real small, like he was trying to put them back in his pocket. One time I asked who they were from. He said, "My daughter." But I never saw him write any back. I figured the post must be slow going east. The silence that followed was suffocating. Eleanor's hand trembled over the ledger. He never wrote back. Because she had never given him a reason to. Because every letter he had sent had been met with a wall of Philadelphia silence. "The letters go both ways, Peter," she whispered. "I reckon they do," the boy said, standing up. "Mr. Calhoun is at the fence line. He says the rain loosened the posts. You should go see. He doesn't like to wait." Calhoun Reed was not a man of words. He was a man of vibration. He felt the tension in the earth, the shift in the wind, and the simmering anger of the woman walking toward him across the muddy yard. "The boy says the fence is down," Eleanor said as she approached. Calhoun didn't turn. He was leaning his weight against a cedar post, testing the give of the saturated soil. Soils turn to soup. Another inch of rain, and the whole eastern boundary will slide into the creek. Your father knew this. That's why he planted the willow brakes 3 years ago. "You speak as if you knew his mind," Eleanor said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I knew his debts," Calhoun said, finally turning. He tipped his hat back, revealing the sharp, tired lines around his eyes. "Harlan Voss saved my life in a gambling den in St. Louis 12 years ago. I was a young Pinkerton with more guts than sense. He didn't know me from Adam, but he stood between me and a shotgun. I spent 12 years trying to pay him back. This," he gestured to the sprawling, beautiful, lonely land, "is the final installment." And after the 15 days? Eleanor asked. Calhoun looked past her toward the road that led to Sacramento and the vast, lawless West beyond. I move on. A man like me doesn't have a hearth, Miss Voss. I have a saddle and a list of people who don't want to find me. That's enough. Pete appeared then, trailing behind them like a shadow. My father said the same thing. He said he was just passing through. Then he saw the way the light hit the valley in the spring, and he stayed 4 years. He said once you see the light here, you don't want to see it anywhere else. Calhoun looked at the boy. There was a kinship there, 2 strays recognizing the same hunger. Light doesn't pay the bills, kid. No, Pete said solemnly. But it makes the work feel like it's for something. That evening, the lawyer Harrington returned. He looked ruffled, his city shoes caked in the thick red mud of the valley. He sat at the kitchen table, which Eleanor had scrubbed until the wood grain gleamed. There is a matter we didn't fully discuss yesterday, Harrington said, pulling a supplemental page from his satchel, regarding the boy, Peter Greer. Eleanor paused her tea-making. Calhoun leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. The boy is an orphan of the ranch, Harrington continued, but in the codicil of the will, Harlan Voss gave him a specific title. He called him the Witness of Place. He is to remain here, supported by the estate, until the final settlement. He is the only one who can verify the seasonal changes and the internal boundaries that haven't been surveyed since the '72 flood. He's 9 years old, Eleanor said. He's lived here longer than both of you combined, Harrington countered. He knows where the springs are. He knows which trees were planted as boundary markers. In the eyes of your father's will, Pete Greer is the living memory of this land. If you want to sell this property, or keep it, you need his witness on the final inventory. Eleanor looked at Pete. The boy was sitting in the corner, whittling a piece of oak. He didn't look up, but his shoulders were tense. He had been here first. He was the bridge between the father Eleanor had lost and the land she didn't want to love. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, Pete slipped out of the back door. He walked to the ancient gnarled oak tree near the stables. He knelt in the damp dirt, his fingers finding a specific stone. Beneath it, buried just deep enough to stay dry, was a small tin box. He didn't open it. He just touched the lid. "The lady is here, Mr. Voss," he whispered into the dark. And the man with the silver eyes stayed. "I'll wait for the right question, just like you said." The third day began with a list. Eleanor Voss believed in lists the way a sailor believed in a compass. If she could name a thing and assign it a value, it became manageable. It became a number that could be subtracted from her life. "We begin at the northern boundary," Eleanor announced at breakfast. Her voice had the sharp, rhythmic cadence of a Philadelphia schoolroom. "We will catalog the acreage, the condition of the soil, and any structures. Mr. Reed, I will require your physical assessment of the timber and the water rights." Calhoun looked at his coffee. He didn't like being managed, but he respected the logic of her approach. "Fine. But the land doesn't care about your ledger, Miss Voss. We go where the mud allows." They set out on foot, Pete trailing 10 paces behind them, carrying a water canteen and a burlap sack for findings. The valley was a sensory assault. The air was thick with the scent of crushed wild mint and the heavy, sweet musk of wet earth. To Eleanor it was chaotic, a landscape that refused to stay within the lines of her maps. To Calhoun, it was a map written in textures. 60 acres of arable land. Eleanor read from the old deed, her boots squelching in the mire. "The record says it was planted in wheat." Calhoun stopped, kneeling to crumble a clod of dark earth between his fingers. He sniffed it, then tasted a tiny grain on his tongue. "It's been fallow for 2 years, purposely. Your father was letting it rest. Look at the clover at the edges. That's nitrogen being put back. If you call this abandoned in your report, you're a fool. It's more valuable now than if it were exhausted by wheat." Eleanor looked at the field. To her it was just weeds and mud. How can you tell? Because I've seen men kill land by overworking it, Calhoun said, standing up and wiping his hands on his trousers. They treat the dirt like a bank they can just keep withdrawing from. Harlan didn't. He treated it like a living thing. Eleanor noted it in her ledger. 60 acres, intentionally fallow for restoration. She found herself watching the way Calhoun moved, the way he stepped over fallen branches with a grace that seemed at odds with his rugged frame. He didn't just walk on the land. He navigated it. By midday, they reached the Western Creek. The crossing was a simple timber bridge, but the recent storms had been unkind. 3 of the heavy oak planks had shifted, leaving a treacherous gap over the rushing, silt-brown water. "We can't get the horses across this for the southern inventory," Calhoun said, surveying the damage. "I need to reset the joints. Pete, go to the shed and bring the sledge and the iron spikes." The boy took off at a run. Eleanor stood at the edge of the bank, looking at the bridge. Her mind instinctively began calculating the load-bearing capacity and the angles of the supports. It was physics, the one thing Philadelphia had taught her that felt useful here. "The center pylon has shifted 3 degrees to the left," Eleanor said. Calhoun looked at her, surprised. 3 degrees? The water pressure from the flood pushed against the base. If you just nail the planks back down, the next heavy rain will snap the primary beam. You need to counterbrace the pylon from the upstream side first. Calhoun squinted at the bridge. He saw what she meant now, a slight, almost invisible tilt in the timber. He looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, for the first time. She wasn't just a city woman with a notebook. She was an observer of patterns. "Can you hold the brace while I drive the spikes?" he asked. "I can," she said, shedding her light traveling jacket. For the next 2 hours, they worked in a silence that was no longer hostile. It was the silence of 2 professionals. Eleanor waded into the shallows, her skirts pinned up, her hands gripping the heavy cedar brace as Calhoun swung the sledgehammer. The sound of the hammer, thwack, 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 echoed off the canyon walls. At one point, Eleanor's foot slipped on a mossy stone. She gasped, her weight shifting. Before she could fall into the cold current, Calhoun's hand was there, his fingers locking around her upper arm with the strength of an iron vise. He pulled her steady, his chest inches from hers. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the rushing water and the heavy thrum of their breathing. Eleanor saw the flecks of amber in his gray eyes. She saw the sweat beading on his forehead. And she saw something else, a flicker of recognition, as if he realized that she wasn't just a daughter seeking a debt, but a woman seeking a foothold. He didn't let go immediately. He waited until he was sure she was balanced. "I have you," he said. The words were simple, but in the hush of the valley, they felt like a vow. "Thank you," she whispered. He stepped back, the moment breaking like a bubble. They finished the bridge. When the last spike was driven, the structure felt solid, a bridge built by the union of her logic and his strength. The afternoon took them to the far northern edge, a place where the valley floor rose into a series of rolling, oak-studded hills. As they crested a ridge, Pete stopped. "This is where the Morrisons lived," he said, pointing to a patch of overgrown grass. Eleanor looked. Hidden beneath a tangle of wild blackberry vines were the charred remains of a foundation. It was small, a one-room cabin, long since claimed by the earth. "The Morrison family," Calhoun said, his voice dropping an octave. "They came from Ohio in '58, lost a child to the winter, then lost the house to a fire. Your father bought the land from the bank, but he never cleared the ruins. He said it was bad luck to erase a man's struggle." Eleanor walked toward the ruins. She noticed a circle of small white stones arranged in the grass near a lone willow tree. It was a grave, a child's grave. "I have to record this," Eleanor said, her pen poised over the paper. "Ruins, non-arable. It affects the valuation." "No," Calhoun said. He stepped between her and the stones. "It doesn't affect anything but the soul of the place. Leave it out of the book, Eleanor." "It's my job to be accurate, Calhoun. The lawyers need a full accounting." "Accuracy isn't just about what you can sell," he countered, his voice hard. "This isn't a ledger in Philadelphia. This is a story. Some parts of it aren't for sale. If you put that in the report, the next owner will plow it under to make the field look clean. Let the Morrisons have their piece." They stood on the ridge, the wind whipping Eleanor's hair across her face. She looked at the small circle of stones, then at the man standing guard over them. She realized then that Calhoun Reed wasn't protecting the land for her father. He was protecting it from her. "I'll list it as natural landmark," she said softly. "I won't mention the stones." Calhoun nodded, his posture relaxing. "Good enough." As they walked back toward the house in the fading light, the thrum of the valley seemed louder. The creek was chattering, the wind was whispering through the high grass, and the mare in the stable let out a long, low whinny. Pete, who had been quiet for hours, suddenly spoke. The water's changing tune. Calhoun stopped, tilting his head. "He's right. The pitch of the creek is higher." "What does that mean?" Eleanor asked. "It means there's more water coming down from the mountains," Calhoun said, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the northwest. "The ground is already full. It can't take much more." "A storm?" Eleanor asked, feeling a prickle of unease. "A test," Calhoun replied. He looked at her, and this time he didn't turn away. He looked at the woman who had helped him fix a bridge, and he saw the mud on her face and the determination in her eyes. "The valley doesn't give anything away for free, Miss Voss. Tomorrow we'll see if this land wants us here or not." Eleanor looked back at the house, the stone and timber sanctuary her father had built in secret. For the first time, she didn't see a chore to be finished. She saw a fortress. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she wanted to be outside the walls or inside them. The fourth day did not arrive with the herald of a storm, but with the dry, rhythmic creak of a saddle. August Bell rode into the yard just as the sun was burning the last of the dew off the valley floor. He was a man who looked less like a human and more like a piece of topographical history. His skin the texture of sun-bleached driftwood. His eyes a faded blue that seemed to have seen every drought since the dawn of the territory. He didn't dismount immediately. He sat atop his sorrel mare, surveying the ranch with the quiet judgment of a man who had lived next to this dirt for 40 years. He saw Eleanor on the porch with her ledgers, and he saw Calhoun by the forge, the rhythmic clink-clink of his hammer pausing at the arrival of a stranger. "August Bell," the old man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I'm here to sign for the western fence line, and to see what Harlan left behind." Eleanor stepped off the porch, wiping her ink-stained fingers on her apron. "Mr. Bell, I'm Eleanor Voss. Thank you for coming." Bell looked at her, his gaze lingering on the shape of her eyes. "You have your father's look, Miss Voss, the kind of look that expects the world to be organized even when it's falling apart." Eleanor stiffened. "I'm here to finalize the estate, Mr. Bell, nothing more." "Is that so?" Bell swung a leg over his pommel and dropped to the ground with a grace that defied his 71 years. "Well, let's see the papers. But don't expect me to sign anything until I've walked the line. Land doesn't tell the truth to lawyers. It only tells the truth to the man with the shovel." The morning was spent in the heavy, deliberate work of boundary verification. Bell moved slowly but with a terrifying efficiency. He didn't use a surveyor's chain. He used landmarks, a specific cluster of creek stones, a lightning-scarred oak, the way the shadows fell at mid-morning. Calhoun walked with them, his hand never far from his belt, his eyes tracking the horizon. He stayed silent, letting the neighbor in the air hash out the geography of the past. But August Bell was not interested in geography. He was interested in the spaces between people. "How long you been here, Reed?" Bell asked as they reached the western creek. 7 weeks, Calhoun replied. "And you, Miss Voss?" 4 days. Belle spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. 7 weeks and 4 days. And in all that time, neither of you has asked the right question. Eleanor looked up from her ledger, her brow furrowing. What question is that? I've asked about the water rights, the timber yields, and the legal standing of the Morrison ruins. Bell shook his head. Those are the questions of a bookkeeper. I'm talking about the questions of a person. You want to know who your father was? You won't find him in these columns of numbers. You'll find him in the letters you haven't answered. The air between them went cold. Eleanor felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. My personal correspondence is not— Harlan Voss died with a hole in his chest, Bell interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. Not from a bullet, from the silence. He wrote to you every month for 7 years. He told me he was building a place where the truth could finally breathe. He didn't want your forgiveness, girl. He wanted your witness. He wanted you to see that a man can be more than his worst mistake. Eleanor turned away, looking toward the distant hills. Her throat felt tight, as if she had swallowed a handful of dry valley dust. I didn't ask for this land. No, Bell said, stepping closer. But you came for it, and you came late. 7 years is a long time to wait for a letter that never comes. Harlan understood why you didn't write. He told me so. He said, she's my daughter. She'd rather be right than be happy. Looks like he knew you better than you knew him. Later, while Eleanor was in the house preparing a cold lunch, Bell found Calhoun alone at the pump. The old man leaned against the timber frame, watching Calhoun wash the grit from his face. You're a Pinkerton, Bell stated. Used to be, Calhoun replied, his voice muffled by the water. A man doesn't use to be a Pinkerton any more than a wolf uses to be a predator. It's in the way you stand. You're waiting for an exit. Calhoun straightened, water dripping from his chin. I made a promise to Harlan. I'm seeing it through. Promises are cheap, Bell said. Purpose is expensive. Harlan told me you'd come. He said you'd come because you didn't have anywhere else to go where people didn't know your name. He said this ranch was a place where a man could stop being a shadow. Harlan talked too much, Calhoun muttered. Maybe. Or maybe he just saw the truth. He told me you stayed away for 3 years after he invited you. Why? Calhoun looked toward the road. Because I knew if I came, I'd want to stay. And a man like me staying in one place is just a slow way to die. Bell laughed, a dry, rattling sound. You think staying is a death? Leaving is the easy part, son. Any coward can ride away. Staying. Staying is the only thing that takes real guts. You look at that woman over there and you tell me you're not already rooted. You look at her like she's the only fixed point in a world that's spinning out from under you. Calhoun didn't answer. He couldn't, because the old man had put words to the silence that had been growing in his chest for 7 weeks. Before Bell departed, he stood at the gate, his horse's reins looped loosely in his hand. He looked at Eleanor, then at Calhoun. Harrington told you the law of the will, Bell said. The 15 days, the concurrent signature. You think it's a legal trick to keep the land out of probate. Isn't it? Eleanor asked. Bell smiled, and for the first time there was a flicker of genuine warmth in his weathered face. Harlan was a lawyer before he was a rancher. He knew that clause wouldn't hold up 10 minutes in a real court if someone had the money to fight it. He didn't write it for the judge. Then why? Calhoun asked. Because he knew that 2 weeks is exactly how long it takes for a person to stop pretending, Bell said. He wanted you two to have to see each other. Not the labels, not the heir and the manager, just the people. He told me once the only way to save someone is to make them stay still long enough to be found. He swung into the saddle and tipped his hat. The rain is coming back tonight, not the light stuff, the kind that reshapes the valley. I'd suggest you two find a way to stand together. Because if you're standing alone when the creek rises, You're both going to drown." He rode off, leaving them in a silence that felt heavier than the approaching clouds. Day 7 was the meridian. It was the point where the novelty of the situation had worn thin, and the reality of their shared existence had begun to calcify into a series of unspoken adjustments. They had stopped explaining themselves. The morning began with the smell of wood smoke and coffee. Eleanor didn't have to ask Calhoun to bring in the extra kindling. It was already stacked by the hearth. Calhoun didn't have to check if the water barrel was full. Eleanor had filled it while the sun was still a promise on the horizon. They moved through the house like two ghosts who had finally agreed on the haunting. At breakfast, Pete sat between them. The boy was the anchor of their domesticity. He placed 3 bowls on the table, always 3, and the sight of them, aligned in a row, was a silent declaration of a temporary family. "The mare is acting strange," Pete said, his mouth full of biscuit. "She's pacing the stall, won't touch her oats." Calhoun looked up, his eyes sharp. "Did she drink?" "A little. But she's pinning her ears back when I get close. She's never done that before." Calhoun looked at Eleanor. "We need to move the southern inventory to tomorrow. If the mare is close, I can't be 3 miles away on the ridge." Eleanor nodded. She didn't argue. She had seen the way Calhoun looked at the animals, not as property, but as responsibilities. "I can help with the house ledgers instead. There's a decade of my father's receipts that need sorting." "Good," Calhoun said. The conversation was utilitarian, devoid of the sharp edges that had defined their first few days. They were no longer fighting the land. They were preparing for it. The mare incident happened at 2 in the afternoon. The sky had turned a sickly shade of bruised yellow, the air thick with the smell of ozone and impending rain. Eleanor was in the study when she heard the scream, a high, shrill sound of animal distress that tore through the quiet of the house. She ran to the porch. Pete was shouting at the stable door. "She's out! Mr. Calhoun, she got through the fence!" The mare, driven by the frantic instincts of a first-time mother in a shifting barometric pressure, had kicked through a weakened section of the corral. She was galloping toward the creek, the very place where the water was beginning to churn with the runoff from the mountains. Calhoun was already moving. He didn't have a horse saddled. He was running on foot, trying to cut her off before she reached the steep, muddy banks of the northern bend. "Pete, get the lead rope!" Calhoun yelled. Eleanor didn't wait to be told what to do. She saw the geometry of the situation instantly. If the mare hit the creek at that speed, she'd slip. If she slipped, she'd lose the foal, or her life. "Calhoun, the gate!" Eleanor screamed, pointing toward the secondary paddock. "Drive her toward the enclosure. I'll block the ridge path." It was a madness. A Philadelphia schoolteacher in a cotton dress, running through the high, wet grass of a California valley to head off a half-ton horse. But Eleanor didn't think about the dress or the mud. She thought about the life inside the mare. She thought about her father's land. She reached the ridge path just as the mare veered toward it. Eleanor didn't wave her arms or scream. She stood perfectly still, her shadow long and imposing in the yellow light. She became a barrier. The mare hesitated, snorting, her eyes rolling back to show the whites. In that second of hesitation, Calhoun arrived. He didn't grab for the halter. He spoke, a low, melodic hum that Eleanor realized was the same sound he made when he was thinking to himself. He moved into the mare's space, slow and steady, until his hand touched her neck. "Easy, girl. Easy. We're just going home." The mare's ears flickered. The tension left her legs. She slumped against him, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Eleanor stood 10 feet away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was covered in mud, her hair had come unpinned, and her breath was a series of sharp stabs in her chest. Calhoun looked over the mare's back at her. His eyes were wide, shocked. "You didn't move," he said softly. "You told me once that I look like I expect the world to be organized." Eleanor panted. "I figured if I stayed in my spot, the horse would have to follow the rules." Calhoun let out a short bark-like laugh. It was the first time she had heard him truly laugh. "You're a terrifying woman, Eleanor Voss. And you're a better man than you think you are." Calhoun Reed. They stood there in the dying light, the horse between them, the first heavy drops of rain beginning to fall. In that moment, the distance of the last 7 days vanished. They weren't strangers anymore. They were two people who had just saved something together. The rain turned into a deluge by nightfall. Inside the house, the fire was the only defense against the gloom. Pete had fallen asleep on the rug, exhausted by the excitement of the afternoon. Eleanor was at the kitchen table, her head bowed over the receipts. The oil lamp was flickering, its wick trimmed low to save fuel. She was squinting, her shoulders hunched in a way that spoke of a deep structural weariness. Calhoun came in from the porch, shaking the water from his duster. He watched her for a moment. He saw the way she rubbed the back of her neck. He saw the stack of letters, the unopened ones, sitting at the corner of the table like a silent accusation. He didn't say anything. He went to the kitchen and returned with a second oil lamp. He lit it and placed it on the right side of her ledger. The light flooded the page, erasing the shadows. Eleanor froze. She didn't look up. She couldn't. The simple kindness of the act, the fact that he had noticed her struggle without her having to voice it, felt more intimate than if he had reached out and touched her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The work is hard enough without doing it in the dark," Calhoun said. He sat down across from her, not to talk, but just to be there. "I almost left today," Eleanor said suddenly. She looked at the unopened letters. "I wrote a note to Harrington this morning. I told him I'd sign a waiver. I told him I didn't care about the land." Calhoun went still. "Why didn't you send it?" "Because I realized that if I left, I'd be doing exactly what my father did. I'd be leaving because I was afraid of what happens if I stay. I've spent my whole life being right, Calhoun, being the teacher who never makes a mistake, the accountant who never loses a penny, but being right is very lonely." Calhoun leaned forward, the lamplight catching the silver in his eyes. "I asked Harrington about a power of attorney yesterday. I was going to sign the management over to Bell and head for Oregon." Eleanor looked at him surprised. "You were?" "I was. I'm a runner, Eleanor. It's what I do. When things get quiet, I get scared. I start looking for the shadow behind the door." He looked around the room, at the sturdy walls, at the sleeping boy, at the woman with the mud on her shoes. "But then the mayor ran. And I realized that if I wasn't here, no one would have heard her. And if you weren't here, I wouldn't have caught her. So we're both here because we're too stubborn to leave," Eleanor said, a small smile playing at her lips. "Maybe," Calhoun said. "Or maybe we're here because for the first time in a long time, we're not the only ones in the room. The only." He reached across the table. He didn't take her hand, not yet, but his fingers brushed against the edge of the ledger, a gesture of solidarity. Outside, the storm broke in earnest. The wind howled through the oaks and the creek began to roar, a wild, untamed sound that promised to change the shape of the valley by morning. But inside the kitchen of Harlan Voss's house, two people sat in the golden circle of two lamps, and for the first time in 7 days, the middle of the road felt like the beginning of a destination. The 8th day was born in a shroud of gray. The rain had settled into a persistent rhythmic drumming against the cedar shingles, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Eleanor's bones. It was a day for staying inside, for the scratching of pens and the low hum of the hearth. Yet the air inside the house felt thinner than the air outside. Harrington arrived at 10 in the morning, his oilskin coat slick and dripping. He didn't come for a casual check-in. He carried a heavy iron lockbox, the kind used by banks to transport gold or by men to transport secrets. "Mr. Voss left instructions that this was to be opened on the 8th day, Harrington said, his voice hushed as he placed the box on the kitchen table. "Only in the presence of the heir and the manager." Calhoun leaned against the counter, his damp hair clinging to his forehead. He looked at the box with the weary suspicion of a man who had seen too many Pandora's boxes in his time. Eleanor sat across from it, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When the lid creaked open, it didn't reveal gold. It revealed 4 distinct layers of a life Harlan Voss had lived in the shadows. Eleanor reached for the official deed first. It was the original contract for the 340 acres. She scanned the elegant looped script of the county clerk, her eyes searching for the familiar numbers. "Wait," she whispered, her fingers stopping dead on the parchment. "This says the purchase was finalized on March 14th, 1872. Calhoun straightened. "The papers we saw before said 73. "In 1872, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "My father was still in Philadelphia. He sat at our dinner table every night. He walked me to the schoolhouse. He told me he was considering a trip west to look for work." She looked at Calhoun, her eyes wide with a sudden sharp betrayal. "He didn't leave because he lost everything in 73. He left because he had already built a whole other life 3,000 miles away, while he was still looking me in the eye. He didn't run to California. He was waiting for the right moment to discard us." Calhoun didn't offer platitudes. He took the deed and studied the date. A year is a long time to keep a secret that big, especially a secret made of dirt and stone. Tucked inside the deed was a small, yellowed slip of paper. It wasn't a legal filing. It was a scrap of ledger paper, covered in Harlan's jagged, hurried handwriting. "If I buy this land and never tell her, will she forgive me? If I tell her and she refuses to come, will she regret it? Which question is the kinder one to leave unanswered?" Eleanor read the words 3 times. The ink was faded, but the agony behind the pen was vivid. This wasn't the writing of a man who wanted to discard his family. It was the writing of a man paralyzed by the weight of his own failure. Calhoun watched her face. He saw the shift from anger to a hollow, aching confusion. He knew that feeling, the realization that the villain of your life was just a man who didn't know how to be a hero. Underneath the papers lay a stack of 12 tintypes. They were arranged in chronological order. They showed the ranch at different stages: a bare hillside, a frame of a house, the completed barn. In the photograph dated 1876, a figure stood in the distance near the great oak. It wasn't Harlan. The man was smaller, younger, with a hat pulled low. Pete, who had been hovering near the doorway, stepped closer. He pointed a small, dirty finger at the image. "That's my father," he said quietly. "Your father was here in 76? Eleanor asked. "He came in 75, Pete said. He told me Mr. Voss found him in a jail in Sacramento and told him he needed a man who knew how to plant roots. He said Mr. Voss saved him so he could save the land." Eleanor looked at the photos. Her father hadn't just bought land. He had built a refuge for people who had nowhere else to go. He had created a family of strays while his own daughter remained a stranger. The last item in the box was not a document at all. It was a heavy brass button, tied to a leather cord. Pete reached into his shirt and pulled out the identical button he wore around his neck. He placed it on the table next to the one from the box. "He gave me mine 2 weeks before he died," Pete said. "He said it was from the coat he wore when he was a man of the law. He said it was a reminder that the law and justice aren't always the same thing, and that I should keep it until the person who knew the difference came to ask for it." Eleanor picked up the button from the box. She turned it over in her palm. It was a court button from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. "He was a lawyer," Eleanor whispered. "A successful one. He walked away from his practice, his reputation, and his home. I thought it was because of money. I thought he was a failure." "Maybe he was," Calhoun said, his voice low. "But failure is a funny thing, Eleanor. Some men fail and get smaller. Some men fail and build 340 acres of penance." The 4 documents sat on the table like the pieces of a shattered mirror. Eleanor looked at the dates, the notes, the photos, and the button. She looked at Calhoun, and then at Pete. The will, Eleanor said, her voice gaining a sudden terrifying clarity. The condition that we both be here, the concurrent signatures, the 15 days. It wasn't a legal requirement, Calhoun finished for her. He knew Harrington couldn't enforce it if it went to a judge. He didn't want a judge, Eleanor said. He wanted this. He wanted us sitting at this table looking at these things. He knew I wouldn't listen to him if he were alive. He knew you wouldn't stay if he didn't give you a job. She looked at the empty lockbox. He didn't leave us land, Calhoun. He left us a mirror. He wanted to see if we were brave enough to look at who we really are when we can't run away. Pete looked from one to the other, his expression solemn. So what do we do now? Neither adult answered. Outside, the rain turned into a roar, drowning out the silence of the room. The 10th day arrived with a drop in barometric pressure that made the horses scream in their stalls. It wasn't just rain anymore. This was a valley shaper, the kind of storm that elders spoke of in whispers, the kind that rearranged the path of the creek and claimed anything that wasn't bolted to the bedrock. By noon, the sky was a bruised charcoal, and the wind was a living thing, clawing at the eaves of the house. "Pete, get the lanterns filled!" Calhoun shouted over the gale. He was pulling on his heavy duster, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. The northern fence is already gone. If the creek crests, the stable is going to flood. Eleanor was at the window, watching the great oak whip back and forth. "The mare," she said, her voice sharp with fear. "Calhoun, she can't stay in the stable. The ground is turning to a bog." "I'm going for her," Calhoun said. "I'll bring her into the lean-to attached to the house. It's higher ground." "You can't lead her alone in this." Eleanor grabbed her heavy wool shawl, wrapping it tight. "Stay inside, Eleanor. This isn't a schoolroom. That mud will pull you under. And that mare will kill you if she panics, and you're the only thing she has to kick." Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes blazing. "I'm the witness of place, remember? My father's land, my father's horse. I'm going." Calhoun looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the steel that Philadelphia had tried to polish away. He didn't argue. He just handed her a coil of rope. "Then stay close to my shoulder. If I say run, you run." The walk to the stable was a battle. The air was a wall of water, thick and blinding. Eleanor felt the earth shifting beneath her boots, a sickening sliding sensation as the topsoil turned to liquid. Inside the stable, the mare was a dervish of terror. She was kicking the slats of her stall, her eyes rolling white in the darkness. The scent of animal sweat and fear was overwhelming. "Easy, girl." Calhoun's voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the thunder. It took both of them. Calhoun held the halter, his muscles straining as the mare reared, while Eleanor stood at her flank, speaking in a low, rhythmic cadence, her hand pressed against the mare's side. She felt the frantic thrum of the horse's heart through the skin, and deeper, the slow, heavy movement of the foal. "We have to move now," Calhoun yelled. They stepped out into the chaos. The lean-to was only 50 yards away, but it felt like 5 miles. Halfway there, a gust of wind tore a sheet of corrugated metal from the shed. It skittered across the yard like a giant blade. The mare bolted. Calhoun was jerked forward, his boots losing purchase in the mud. Eleanor didn't think. She threw her weight onto the secondary lead, her fingers burning as the rope cinched tight. She dug her heels into the muck, her spine popping with the strain. "Hold her!" Calhoun roared. For 10 agonizing seconds, they were a tripod of bone and grit against the storm. The mare stopped. She stood shivering, her head pressed into Calhoun's chest. They made it to the lean-to. As the heavy wooden door slammed shut against the wind, the 3 of them, man, woman, and horse, collapsed into the straw, gasping for air. The lean-to was dark, lit only by the faint gray light filtering through the cracks. It was silent here, the roar of the storm muffled by the thick timber walls. Calhoun turned to Eleanor. He saw the blood before she did. "You're cut," he said, his voice hoarse. He reached out, his hand surprisingly gentle as he took her left wrist. A jagged piece of the metal sheet had caught her as it flew by. Not deep, but the blood was bright and steady against her pale skin. He didn't ask permission. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean linen handkerchief, a relic of his Pinkerton days. He knelt in the straw before her and began to bind the wound. Eleanor watched his hands. They were scarred, rough, and stained with the valley's dirt, yet they moved with a precision that was almost tender. She looked at the top of his head, at the wet hair and the way his shoulders rose and fell with his breath. The proximity was a physical weight. The scent of him, rain, tobacco, and wood smoke, filled her senses. He finished the knot and didn't let go. He kept his fingers locked around her wrist, his thumb resting against the frantic beat of her pulse. He looked up, and for 2 seconds the world stopped. There was no storm. There was no land. There was only the gray of his eyes and the sudden terrifying realization that Eleanor didn't want him to pull away. She saw the same hunger in him, a hunger for a place to land, for a person who wouldn't let go when the water rose. Calhoun's gaze dropped to her mouth. He shifted, his body leaning toward hers, the straw crinkling beneath his weight. Then the mare let out a low, soft nicker. Calhoun blinked, the spell breaking. He cleared his throat and stood up, his hands sliding away from her skin like silk. "You should get inside. Pete will be worried." "Yes," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "Pete?" An hour later, as they sat in the kitchen wrapped in blankets, August Bell appeared at the back door like a waterlogged apparition. He didn't come in. He just stood in the threshold, water pouring off his hat. "The creek has taken the lower bridge," as Bell said, "but the house is holding." He looked at the two of them, the way they were sitting just a little too close, the way Eleanor was clutching the bandage on her wrist. "Harlan Voss lost this land once," Bell said, his voice carrying over the wind. "In 1868, a flood just like this. He sat on this very porch and watched everything he built float toward the Pacific. He spent 12 years in the East, working as a lawyer he hated, just to buy it back." Eleanor looked up. "He bought it back? This is the same land?" "Every inch," Bell said. "He told me the land wasn't the prize. The prize was being the man who stayed when the water came back. He wanted to know if he had built it strong enough this time." Bell looked at Calhoun. He wanted to know if he had found the right people to stand on it. That night, for the first time in 7 years, Eleanor Voss opened the letters. She sat at the table while the storm raged outside. One by one, she read the 84 missives her father had sent. She read about the planting of the willow trees. She read about the birth of the horses. And in the final letter, dated 3 months ago, she read the sentence that broke her. "I have spent my life building fences, Eleanor. I built them to keep the world out, and all I did was trap myself inside. I am leaving you this land not because I want you to be a farmer, but because I want you to have a place where you don't have to be a wall." In the next room, Calhoun Reed lay awake on his cot, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the faint rustle of paper from the kitchen. He could hear the rain. And he realized, with a clarity that terrified him, that he wasn't looking for the door anymore. He was waiting for the morning. He was waiting to see if, for the first time in his life, he was the man who stayed. The world that emerged from the Valley Shaper was unrecognizable. The vibrant gold and green of the Sacramento spring had been swallowed by a thick, suffocating mantle of red-brown silt. The creek, once a chattering companion, was now a bloated, silent predator, its banks carved into raw, jagged wounds. Trees that had stood for a century were sprawled across the fields like fallen giants, their roots exposed to the pale, mocking sunlight, like the ribs of a shipwreck. But for Eleanor Voss, the external wreckage was nothing compared to the internal landscape revealed by 84 letters. She stood on the porch on the morning of the 12th day, her eyes stinging from lack of sleep. The letters were neatly stacked back in her handbag. but their contents were branded into her mind. She looked at the mud-caked yard and didn't see a burden. She saw a man who had spent 7 years trying to build a bridge out of sentences only for his daughter to refuse to walk across it. Calhoun was already in the yard. He was waist-deep in a sinkhole near the stable, wrestling with a massive oak limb that had crushed the corner of the fence. He looked exhausted. His movements were slower than they had been on the first day, his shoulders burdened by a weariness that went deeper than bone. He didn't look at her when she stepped down into the mud. He didn't acknowledge the bandage he had tied around her wrist the night before. The intimacy of the lean-to had been buried under the immediate brutal necessity of survival. "The northern well is fouled," Calhoun said, his voice like grinding gravel. He didn't look up from the branch. "We'll have to haul water from the upper spring until the silt settles. And the mare is still skittish. She won't let Pete near her back legs." "I'll help with the water," Eleanor said. She was wearing her oldest dress, the hem already ruined, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. "You should stay in the house, Eleanor. There's glass to be swept and the cellar needs pumping." "The cellar can wait," she replied, her voice firm. "The land needs us out here." She walked toward him, her boots sinking deep into the mire. They worked for 3 hours in a silence that was different from the silence of the first week. It wasn't a silence of strangers, nor was it the silence of professionals. It was the silence of two people who were afraid that if they spoke, the fragile structure of their concurrent period would collapse. The air was heavy with things unsaid, about the letters, about the lean-to, and about the fact that in 3 days the clock would hit 0. Pete was the only one who didn't seem afraid of the silence. He moved between them like a small, busy ghost, gathering smaller branches into piles for burning. He watched the two adults with a gaze that was uncomfortably perceptive. He saw the way Eleanor's eyes followed the line of Calhoun's back. He saw the way Calhoun paused every time Eleanor moved too close to the unstable fence line, his hand twitching as if to reach for her before he caught himself. Around noon, they stopped by the fence. The heat was beginning to rise, turning the mud into a humid, stinking vapor. Pete sat on a stump, wiping his face with a grimy sleeve. He looked at Eleanor, who was staring blankly at a row of downed fence posts. "Why are you sad, Miss Eleanor?" the boy asked. Eleanor startled, her pen-stained fingers clutching the hem of her apron. "I'm not sad, Peter. I'm just focused. There's a lot of work to do." Pete shook his head slowly. "That's not it. Yesterday, during the storm, you looked at Mr. Reed like he was the only thing standing. Today, you won't even look at his shadow. It's like you're trying to make him disappear." Eleanor felt a sharp, cold prickle in her chest. "Peter, that's not—" "Grown-ups are funny," Pete interrupted, his voice matter-of-fact. "You're scared of the good things just as much as the bad ones. Maybe more. Because if the good thing breaks, it hurts worse, right?" Eleanor sat down on the muddy ground, her dignity long since surrendered to the valley. She looked at the 9-year-old child and saw a wisdom she had paid thousands of dollars in Philadelphia tuition to avoid. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. "If the good thing breaks, you're left with nothing but the memory of how it felt to have it. Sometimes it's easier to never have it at all." Pete nodded, as if she had just confirmed a simple mathematical truth. "That's what my father said about the mare. He said she kicks because she's afraid of being cared for. If she lets you brush her, she has to trust you won't leave when the winter comes. It's easier for her to just stay wild and angry." He stood up and walked toward Calhoun, who had stopped his work to listen, though he kept his back turned. "Are you sad too, Mr. Reed?" Pete asked. Calhoun didn't answer for a long time. He struck the oak limb with his axe, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the valley. "I have work to do, Pete." "That's what you always say," Pete said, undeterred. "But you're looking at the road again. Every time you think we aren't looking, you look at the gate. You're checking the distance." Calhoun turned then, his eyes hard and gray as the river's silt. "A man needs to know where his exits are, kid. That's how you stay alive." "My father said that too," Pete replied. "Until he met Mr. Voss. Then he stopped looking at the gate. He said he finally found a place where he didn't have to be a shadow. Pete looked from the man to the woman, his small face set in a mask of grim determination. I think you're both lying to me, and I think you're lying to each other. The work continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Pete had lanced the boil of their silence, and now the truth was beginning to leak out. As the sun began to dip toward the western ridge, the three of them moved to the northern edge of the property to clear the debris from the Morrison ruins. The storm had unearthed more of the foundation, washing away the weeds and blackberry vines to reveal the cold, hard reality of the family that had failed here. Eleanor stood by the circle of white stones, the child's grave. The storm had shifted them, but they hadn't washed away. They were still there, a stubborn testament to a love that had stayed even after the life had gone. My father bought this land twice, Eleanor said, her voice carrying over the wind. Calhoun stopped his clearing. He leaned on his shovel, watching her. I read the letters, Calhoun. Letters. Chai, she continued. He lost it all in '68. He went back to Philadelphia not because he wanted to, but because he was a coward. He couldn't stand to look at the mud. He spent 12 years being a lawyer, a man of words, because he thought words could build a wall against the truth of what he'd lost. But he hated every minute of it. He hated the letters I didn't write, but he hated the words he did write even more, because they weren't enough to bring me here. She looked at Calhoun, her eyes bright with tears. He didn't stay because he was strong. He stayed because he finally realized that running away is just a different kind of prison. Calhoun walked toward her, his boots heavy in the mud. He stood on the other side of the white stones. I spent 12 years chasing people for the Pinkertons, he said. I lived in hotels and on trails. I never owned more than what a horse could carry. I told myself it was freedom. I told myself I was a man of the road. He looked down at the grave. But when I arrived here 7 weeks ago, I realized I wasn't a man of the road. I was just a man who was afraid of being seen. If you stay in one place long enough, people start to see the cracks in your armor. They start to see that you're just as lost as they are. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not touching. Harlan knew that. He knew that if he forced us to stay here for 15 days, we wouldn't be able to keep our armor on. He knew the mud would get into the cracks. Pete joined them at the ridge. He was holding the small tin box he had unearthed from the oak tree after the storm had loosened the soil. He didn't open it. He just held it like a sacred relic. 2 weeks before he died, Pete said, Mr. Voss sat with me right here. He was looking at the road, just like you do, Mr. Reed. But he wasn't looking for an exit. He was looking for a ghost. Pete looked at Eleanor. He told me he had a secret. He said he bought this land a second time, not to make money, but to make a choice. He said, Pete, I spent my whole life being a man of law, but the law doesn't tell you how to be brave. It only tells you how to be right. The boy opened the tin box. Inside was a small, withered flower, a pressed California poppy, and a single handwritten note on a scrap of parchment. He told me to give this to you when the right person asked the right question, Pete said. Eleanor took the note. Her breath hitched. It was her own handwriting. It was a scrap from a letter she had written when she was 10 years old, the only letter she had ever sent him after he left. It was a simple drawing of a house with a sun and a single sentence. When are you coming home? He kept it, Eleanor whispered, the paper trembling in her hand. Through the flood, through the 12 years in Philadelphia, through the move back, he kept this one scrap of paper. He didn't keep it to remind him of what he lost, Pete said. He told me he kept it to remind him of what he was waiting for. He said he was waiting for the person who was brave enough to ask that question again. Pete looked at Calhoun. And he told me that the man who saved his life in St. Louis was the only one he trusted to make sure that person stayed long enough to answer it. The boy turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the two adults on the ridge. The silence that followed was absolute. The sun had disappeared behind the Sierras, leaving the valley in a deep violet twilight. The air was cooling, the scent of wet earth and crushed wild mint rising around them. Eleanor looked at the scrap of paper, then at the man standing across from her. "I wrote to Harrington 3 days ago," she said, her voice steady. "I asked him to speed up the papers. I wanted to be on the train by Saturday." Calhoun nodded. "I know. Harrington told me. I didn't send the follow-up," she said. "I didn't ask him to finish it today." Calhoun took a step closer. The mud between them was thick, but it no longer felt like a barrier. "I was going to ask him for a power of attorney. I was going to leave the management to Bell and go to Oregon." "Why didn't you?" Calhoun looked at her, really looked at her, erasing the distance of the last 12 days. "Because Pete asked me why I was checking the gate, and I realized I wasn't checking it because I wanted to leave. I was checking it because I was afraid someone was going to come and tell me I had to." He reached out then, and this time he didn't hesitate. His hand, rough and mud-stained, covered hers. His thumb brushed over the bandage he had tied. "I don't know how to stay, Eleanor," he whispered. "I don't know how to be a man of the hearth. I don't know how to be anything but a woman of the ledger," she replied, her fingers interlocking with his. "But I think the land doesn't care about our titles." So they stood on the ridge, two fugitives who had finally run out of horizon. Below them, the ranch was a mess of broken fences and silted fields. It was a disaster. It was a burden. It was a wreck. And for the first time in their lives, it was exactly where they wanted to be. 15 days, Eleanor said. 15 days, Calhoun agreed. But they both knew that the number didn't matter anymore. The concurrent period had become a lifetime. The 14th day arrived with a silence that was heavier than the storm. The Sacramento Valley, scrubbed clean by the rain, glowed with a predatory beauty. The air was so clear it hurt to breathe, smelling of wet stone, pine needles, and the iron scent of the creek. It was the day before the world would demand a decision. Eleanor was in the stable before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. She didn't go there to count the tack or check the grain stores. She went because the four walls of the house had begun to feel like a cage. She stood by the mare's stall, watching the animal's heavy, rhythmic breathing. The mare was calm now, but her eyes were weary. Her body settled into the patient, grueling weight of the final hours. When Eleanor returned to the house, she found Harrington's final report sitting on the kitchen table. It was the inventory of the main house, the one section she had avoided completing. To finish it meant entering her father's study again, touching the ghost of his desk, and acknowledging that the work was done. But someone had already been there. The report was complete. Every chair, every lamp, and every legal volume in Harlan's study had been catalogued in a steady, slanted hand. At the bottom, in the space for the witness, was a simple note. Verified by C. Reed, day 14. Eleanor ran her fingers over the ink. Calhoun hadn't just listed the items. He had adopted her style. He had used her abbreviations, her method of categorization, and her precise way of describing the condition of the wood. It was an act of translation. He had learned her language so she wouldn't have to speak it. "I didn't want you to have to go back into that room today," a voice said from the doorway. Calhoun was leaning against the frame, a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, but the restless, predatory edge in his posture had softened into something else, something sturdier. "You matched my handwriting," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've spent 14 days watching you write," Calhoun replied. "I know how you curve your S when you're tired. And I know you've been tired for a long time, Eleanor." The honesty of it hit her like a physical blow. She stood up, the chair scraping against the floorboards. "I wrote to Harrington again, last night." Calhoun didn't flinch. "I know. I told him I'm not leaving, not yet." She walked toward the window, looking out at the yard where Pete was already busy hauling water. "I didn't write back to my father because I thought if I ignored the letters, The pain of his absence would stay a number, something I could balance. But these 2 weeks, they've made me realize that some debts aren't meant to be paid. They're meant to be lived in. Calhoun set his cup down and walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was standing just behind her, not touching, but close enough that his warmth radiated through her cotton dress. Harlan told me once that the hardest thing a man can do is stand still when the earth is moving, Calhoun said. I've been moving for 12 years, Eleanor. I thought I was free, but I was just a ghost in a duster. I stayed here because of a promise to a dead man. But I'm staying today because for the first time in my life, I don't want to see what's over the next hill. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder before finally settling there. It was a heavy, grounding weight. I don't have a dowry, he said with a rough, dry wit. Just a horse that likes you more than me, and a reputation that needs a lot of scrubbing. I have a ledger, Eleanor replied, turning to face him. Her eyes were bright, but her voice didn't waver. And a very stubborn streak, and a house that needs a new roof. The moment was interrupted by a sharp, piercing whistle from the yard. It was Pete. Mr. Calhoun, Miss Eleanor, it's time, she's down. The next 3 hours were a blur of straw, sweat, and primal necessity. The mare's labor was long and difficult, a physical manifestation of the land's struggle. There were no words, only the coordinated efforts of 3 people who had become a single machine. Eleanor held the mare's head, her hands buried in the coarse mane, whispering Philadelphia lullabies into a twitching ear. Calhoun worked at the other end, his muscles straining, his movements calm and deliberate. Pete ran between the house and the stable, bringing warm water and clean blankets, his face set in a mask of grim adult focus. When the foal finally slid into the straw, a wet, spindly-legged colt the color of autumn leaves, a profound silence fell over the stable. The mare let out a low, exhausted nicker and began to lick her son. Pete collapsed into the straw, grinning through the dirt on his face. Calhoun sat back, wiping his brow with his sleeve. He looked at Eleanor, who was covered in straw and horsehair, her dress ruined beyond repair. He reached out and squeezed her hand. A witness of place, Calhoun whispered, nodding toward Pete. The kid was right. Some things you have to see to believe. August Bell appeared at the stable door as the sun was setting. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the new colt, then at Eleanor and Calhoun sitting together in the straw. Harlan had a theory, Bell said, leaning on the doorframe. He said you could judge a person by how they treated a creature that couldn't give them anything back. He wanted to know if the 2 of you could handle the mess of this place. He looked at Eleanor. He died knowing you were coming, and he died knowing Calhoun wouldn't let you fall. That was the answer he was looking for. Bell turned to go, but paused. Harrington will be here at dawn. Have your pens ready. It's time to stop being guests. The 15th day was as mundane as a legal document. The air was still. The creek had retreated into its bed, leaving behind a new layer of silt that would, in a year's time, become the richest soil in the valley. Harrington arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, his buckboard rattling up the drive. He looked at the 3 of them, Eleanor, Calhoun, and Pete, standing on the porch, and for the first time the lawyer didn't look at his watch. He laid the final documents on the kitchen table. 3 choices, Harrington said, his voice stripped of its usual professional coldness. You can sell the land today to a consortium in Sacramento for a significant sum. You can transfer the deed entirely to one party. Or... He paused, looking at the way Eleanor's hand was resting near Calhoun's on the table. Or you can register for joint ownership. It requires a commitment to stay and work the land for a minimum of 5 years before any sale can be considered. Eleanor didn't look at the papers. She looked at Calhoun. 5 years is a long time for a man who likes the road, she said. It's a blink of an eye for a man who's found home, Calhoun replied. They signed together. The pens scratched in unison across the parchment. Pete signed as the witness, his hand small but steady. August Bell added his mark at the bottom, the final seal of the community. As Harrington drove away, the ranch felt different. It was no longer a legacy or a debt. It was theirs. The epilogue of the summer was written in the work. The northern fence was rebuilt, not with temporary patches, but with solid oak posts driven deep into the earth. The roof of the stable was replaced with shingles that would withstand a century of storms. The Morrison ruins remained, but they were no longer a symbol of failure. They were a garden now, where Eleanor had planted the seeds she had brought from Philadelphia. The colt, named Harlan by Pete, grew strong and fast, a copper-colored streak across the fields. On a warm evening in late July, the three of them sat on the porch. The heat of the day was fading, replaced by the cool breeze from the mountains. Eleanor was reading a book, a history of the territory, while Calhoun sat beside her cleaning a piece of tack. Pete was at the great oak showing the colt how to find the sweetest grass. "I found another letter today," Eleanor said, not looking up from her book. "In the back of the ledger. It was just a note." Calhoun stopped his work. "What did it say?" "It said, 'The land doesn't belong to the man belongs to the land. And if he's lucky, he finds someone to belong to it with him.'" Calhoun smiled, a slow, genuine expression that reached his eyes. He reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "Harlan was a smart man." "He was a stubborn man," Eleanor corrected softly. "Just like us." The sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the valley. "We need to paint the front fence tomorrow," Pete called out from the yard, his voice bright and clear. "It's starting to peel." Eleanor and Calhoun looked at each other. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said. "Tomorrow," Calhoun agreed. There was no more waiting, there was no more running. In the heart of the Sacramento Valley, three people had stopped looking at the gate and started looking at the light. The water was flowing, the grass was growing, and for the first time in their lives, the horizon was exactly where it was supposed to be. They stayed until the stars came out, three silhouettes against the vast, quiet peace of a home they had finally stopped running from. At its heart, this story teaches us that love, healing, and belonging all require one thing: courage to stay. This channel is dedicated to stories of the Wild West: cowboys, love, family, compassion, and the quiet beauty of human connection. The message is simple but powerful. We don't find home by running. We find it by choosing to remain. If you felt something while listening, please like, comment your thoughts, share with someone close to you, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
As the dust settles over the valley and the sound of the creek returns to its quiet, steady rhythm, what remains is not just a story about land, inheritance, or survival, but a story about the quiet, often painful transformation of the human heart. What we have witnessed is not merely the journey of Eleanor, Calhoun, and Pete, but a reflection of something deeply familiar within all of us: the instinct to run, to protect ourselves from loss, from vulnerability, from the possibility of being hurt again. And yet, this story gently reminds us that while running may offer temporary safety, it also keeps us from the very thing we long for most: connection, belonging, and peace. Eleanor arrived with a ledger in her hand and walls around her heart, believing that life could be measured, controlled, and balanced like numbers on a page. Calhoun came with nothing but a restless soul, convinced that staying in one place was a weakness he could not afford. And Pete, perhaps the wisest among them, stood quietly between these two worlds, carrying the memory of what it means to stay, to witness, and to believe in something beyond fear. Together, they were not just managing a piece of land, they were learning how to rebuild themselves. The greatest lesson this story offers is that healing does not happen in isolation. It happens in the presence of others, in shared struggle. in moments where we choose to stay, even when every instinct tells us to leave. The land itself becomes a metaphor, a living, breathing reminder that growth requires patience, that storms will come, and that what is broken can be rebuilt, stronger and more meaningful than before. Just as the soil must rest to become fertile again, so too must we allow ourselves the space to feel, to confront the past, and to forgive, not only others, but ourselves. Another powerful truth woven through this story is the idea that being right is not the same as being whole. Eleanor spent years holding on to her sense of righteousness, believing that her silence was justified. Calhoun held on to his independence, believing that detachment was strength. But both discovered that these beliefs, while protective, were also prisons. It is only when they allowed themselves to be seen, truly seen, that they began to understand what it means to live fully. Vulnerability, in this sense, is not weakness. It is the doorway to transformation. And then there is the quiet, enduring message about belonging. We often think of home as a place we return to, but this story suggests something deeper. Home is something we choose. It is built through commitment, through shared effort, through the willingness to stand side by side with others, even when the ground beneath us is uncertain. The ranch was never just land. It was an opportunity, a test, and ultimately, a gift. Not a gift of ownership, but a gift of purpose. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in the idea of staying. In a world that constantly encourages movement, escape, and reinvention, this story dares to suggest that true courage lies in stillness, in facing what we have avoided, in remaining when things become difficult, and in choosing to build rather than abandon. Staying does not mean being trapped. It means being present. It means giving life the chance to unfold, even when it is messy, unpredictable, and painful. By the end, the horizon no longer represents an escape, but a promise, a quiet assurance that life, when embraced fully, will always offer something worth staying for. And so, as we leave this story behind, we carry with us a simple but powerful truth. We do not find peace by running from our past, but by turning toward it, understanding it, and allowing it to shape us into something stronger, kinder, and more complete. This is not just a story about the Wild West. It is a story about the wilderness within us, and the courage it takes to finally call it home.